From the US to India to Hungary, authoritarian movements are rising in popularity across the globe. But why do these movements gain traction in the first place? And do we need a fundamental restructuring of society? This week on UpFront, I'll ask those questions to Nancy Fraser, professor of philosophy and politics at the New School. Nancy Fraser, thank you so much for joining us on UpFront.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
You talk about how the world is facing multiple crises, crises that can't be understood if we look at them as separate or distinct. In fact, you said it can't just be a coincidence that the planet is burning up at the same time that police are murdering black men and women in the streets, at the same time that people are running from job to job. This is not a coincidence. In this present moment, what are the threats that we face and how are they connected?
Yeah. So I think of this as a general crisis of the whole social order, of the whole civilization, if you like. In other words, as opposed to a sectoral crisis, like an economic crisis or a political crisis. Those things are part of the current mix, but there are others as well. A crisis of social reproduction or of care and of family life, a crisis of racial oppression and injustice and imperial oppression, a crisis of democracy, a crisis of ecology. These are all happening at the same time, and that's what makes it a general crisis. And then the next question is, are they separate or are they all interconnected and traceable to one and the same social system? And I believe that that second view is the correct view. There is one social system that is very deeply irrational and perverse in many ways, and that is generating, non-accidentally, for systemic reasons, an ecological crisis at the same time as a financial crisis, a crisis of livelihood, a crisis of political rule and geopolitical hegemony. This is a very dangerous moment. Crises like these are quite rare historically. They don't come along every day. We may have had 3 or 4 in the modern history of capitalism. By the way, I just gave it away.
Yeah.
From capitalism,
I was going to say
is the social system.
I was going to do the drum roll. I was going to say, would it be too simplistic to say that the single source of all of these multiple crises is capitalism?
I don't think so. I think that it is. However, everything depends on what we mean by capitalism. Usually people think of that as an economic system.
Yeah.
And then if you take that view, then it seems like, well, you know, then you're assuming the economy drives everything and you get an economic determinism. And that's problematic. I think that capitalism is the whole social order, and that part of what goes on here is that it separates, apparently, the economy from the political system, from nature, from family life and the social reproductive side of things, from geopolitics. The problem is the economy is allowed to prey on all of those things. It's allowed to devour care work. It's allowed to devour political capacities. It's allowed to devour nature. In fact, more than allowed, the system incentivizes large investors and mega corporations to help themselves to all of those sources of wealth and energy and so on, to help themselves, and it gives them no responsibility, zero responsibility to repair what they damage and to replenish what they take. That's what I mean by perverse. It's a very perverse system.
And that explains the title of your latest book, which is called Cannibal Capitalism: How Our System is Devouring Democracy, Care, and the Planet, and What We Can Do About It. But the term cannibal, I thought, was a provocative term. I mean, it has a long history, a long racist history. European colonial powers used that term to degrade and to dehumanize populations that they subjugated. I'm thinking specifically about the Black African populations. You seem to be using the term differently, though. You're not using it to denigrate. You're using it, at least not the vulnerable, you're using it to critique the capitalist class. Why that term?
It's exactly to turn the tables and say, you want to talk about cannibals? Who are the real cannibals? It's the large investors, the mega corporations, and all of their political flunkies who do their bidding. They are basically sucking dry the wealth, health, energies, and capacities of working people all over the globe. So we, the working people, are being cannibalized by the capitalist class, if you like. So I'm giving you a quasi-Marxist thing, but I'm expanding what I mean by capitalism to take into account the relation between capital and nature, capital and care work and family life, capital and politics, both at the domestic national level and at the geopolitical level. It's not just an economic system. It's a system that puts all those other things at the mercy of powerful economic
I'm glad you
actors.
say that. Let's drill down on the political part for a second. There are viewers who are going to say, if you have a democracy, all the people have to do is vote against that. Vote against the Elon Muskification of the world. Vote against the idea that corporations don't pay enough taxes. Vote against the idea that that the wealthy won't have to pay capital gains. All of the things that make it harder for everyday people. If everybody has a vote, why can't they just make different choices?
Yeah, this is a great paradox because I think everyone expected when universal suffrage was introduced that something like that would happen. And to be fair, there have been periods, the Social Democratic New Deal era and so on, where something a bit better happened because of the votes. But the problem is another aspect of the political system. The political crisis has two faces. It has that governance problem, and then it has what we could call the hegemony problem, the problem of consciousness, of common sense in the the sort of worldviews that people bring through which they interpret what's happening. Well, and everybody watching this knows that we've had this amazing defection from what used to be the ruling common sense in the world, the neoliberal establishment parties, this huge rebellion, which had some more emancipatory leftish currents at one point, but we have to admit is now dominated by various forms of right-wing rebellion and populism, which are anything but emancipatory.
Yeah.
So these people are angry. They are reacting to the fact that government is not working for them, that their jobs don't pay enough, that they don't have stable work, that they don't have time to sort of raise their children in the way they want to, and so on. They're reacting to all of that, but with a very incorrect diagnosis of what the problem is.
Let's talk about the diagnosis, right?
Yeah.
People, as you're pointing out, are saying, look, the government's not working. Our problems are not being solved by the systems in place, by the politicians in place, et cetera. And then they make choices, whether it's in Italy, whether it's in Hungary, whether it's in India, whether it's right here in the United States. They make choices toward right-wing authoritarian models. Why do they make those choices? Why are those compelling choices to people?
Well, I think a lot of it, now here I think I have to double down a little bit on the United States because I know so much more about it.
Fair enough.
I think that with the exception in 2016 of the attempt to build the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democrat, with the exception of that, they have had no alternative.
Yeah.
There is no counter-narrative that is saying the kinds of things that we are saying here. What the narrative is that the problem is the Mexican rapists, the Muslims, the trans people, et cetera, the undocumented immigrants. So the deep state, wokeism. Here's a whole elaborate account of what the problem is. And people buy it, however illogical it is. Not everyone, but a substantial segment of the electorate in the U.S. has bought this story. And where is the counter story that? And the problem is that the dominant wing of the Democratic Party has now, for 3 election cycles, done the exact same horrible thing, which has been to not offer, say, you guys are right, there is a serious problem, there's a serious crisis, but here's the real story about what causes it and what we have to do. No, instead of that, it's, oh, look what Trump just said, look what Trump just did. I think a big part of the problem is a lack of alternative. And then you would have to actually also figure in the sort of charisma of a figure like Trump or Modi, or, a lot of these people actually sort of, they radiate a kind of not only authenticity, but, that they're going to really do something. They're going to fight for you.
How does the left, not just the liberals, but the actual left, mount a substantive response or build an alternative to what we have right now?
Well, basically, I don't know that we even have anything we could actually call the left. What we have is an impressive but uncoordinated array of democratizing and emancipatory or potentially emancipatory social movements and struggles, including Palestine Solidarity, including Me Too, including Movement for Black Lives, including certain strands of the radical ecology movement, and so on and so forth, and some interesting and important efforts to revive trade unionism, organizing the unorganized, and so on. These are, to my way of thinking, these are the potential building blocks of something that we could call a historic or hegemonic bloc, the kind of broad political force that could, in theory, present itself as a credible alternative to the liberal and liberal/neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party on the one hand, and to MAGA and all of its counterparts around the world on the other. But for that to happen, and this is what I was trying to get at in my book, these different potential constituent elements of this kind of a force would have to begin to understand that it is, again, that one and the same social system that is at the root. What I've been trying to do is connect the dots and say to people, if we could all understand the way in which we are connected in this perverse way through this predatory social system, then we would have a different sense of who our real allies are and who our real enemies are, because some of these social movements have been co-opted by the liberal/neoliberal progressives.
Yeah. Let's look at some examples of that, because you connect some of those dots for us quite masterfully, I think. You give an example of how capitalism has historically exploited unpaid care work, housework, child rearing, elder care. In the 1980s, when women were encouraged to join the workforce, care work was outsourced often to migrant workers from poorer countries. The result was what you call a care crunch. What does that mean? Can you explain what a care crunch is?
Yeah. Several things are going on at once, and it's the convergence that makes the crunch. On the one hand, the old family wage ideal that a male worker should be paid a salary large enough to support the whole family so that the wife can be a full-time housekeeper and mother and care provider. That is dead in the water. That's part of this neoliberal attack on the unions, the outsourcing of higher paid manufacturing jobs, the introduction of low-wage precarious service work, a whole different economy from the sort of 40s, 50s, and so on. So households have to work more hours at paid work in order to maintain the same standard of living. Second thing, cutback on public social services. That's also part of neoliberalization. Okay, so these two things are coming together. That means a real time crunch. People they can't afford, their wages are too low, they can't afford childcare to pay for himself. The public Head Start and kindergartens and all of this stuff is being cut, and they don't have time to do it themselves. Meanwhile, you have something else going on. You have the educated, more prosperous professional managerial class of women becoming doctors, lawyers, corporate execs, very demanding, long hours work, and they can afford to hire people to pick up the slack. So where we used to mainly attract migrants to do agricultural labor and we still have and restaurant work and so on, now lots of migrant labor is doing domestic work, either in for-profit institutions like old age homes or rehab centers and so on, or in private homes.
There's a way that this is being presented to the world, not as there's an exploitation of labor from the global south. It's look at this new generation and class of women who can now have it all, who can now be corporate CEOs, who don't have to be bound to the domestic sphere. They're leaning in. and this is called feminism in many ways.
Exactly.
But there's a connection between that and what's happening in capitalism.
It's totally connected. You don't have the quote-unquote liberation of the global north professional managerial class woman without this exploitation or expropriation of migrant women of color from the global south.
Absolutely. And you give an example of companies that now offer egg freezing to their childbearing employees. Now, many see this, again, as something that's liberating, that someone can now choose to have children later in life if they want to. But you see the fact that it's become commonly offered by big corporate firms as a strategy, as a way of saying, wait and have your kids in your 40s, your 50s, heck, even maybe your 60s. Devote all of your high energy, productive years to us.
Right.
That's a very different way of thinking about this.
Yeah. Look, that is a symptom of this care crunch. That women feel that they can't afford to have kids in the way, at the ages that people used to, and they have to go to these technological extremes. The other example I gave is mechanical pumping of breast milk, so that you can work and still so-called breastfeed your child. Of course, if that's really breastfeeding, I don't know. But in any case, we're always, this is the U.S. We're always going for technological fixes to problems that really require a root and branch transformation of the underpinnings of the whole social system.
You also talk about how capitalism usually relies on the pillaging of the earth, which has led to environmental degradation. In LA, just recently, they've had wildfires that have killed at least 29 people. Not to mention 2024 was the warmest year on record. And over the past few years, the world has seen catastrophic floods in Spain, extreme heat waves in India, typhoons across East Asia. In light of this, you have stated that in order to save the planet, we need an eco-politics that is anti-capitalist. You call it, I believe, eco-socialism. How do we get there?
Well, how we get there, that's a very complicated issue, but I just want to say that I do believe that it is this predatory relation to nature that is built into capitalism, that is so intrinsic to capitalism, that nature is just there for extraction, exactly. Again, as I said before, no responsibility to replenish or repair.
But what would they look like differently in a socialist context? I mean, you still need to extract oils and gas and minerals for just to power the devices we have in society. I mean, it is in a different mode of production.
Right. So, I mean, this is, again, a really interesting but complicated question. The thing is that in capitalism, the incentive to trash nature is hardwired. In socialism, it is not hardwired, although really existing socialist countries followed the sort of fossil path, trying to play catch up and
That's
on.
right.
They did plenty of damage. I'm not saying they don't do damage, but that system doesn't require it in the same way that capitalism does. So, I mean, look, the answer is to defossilize. We have to transition, and rather quickly, to renewables, especially solar and wind and water. We can't keep with the oil, the natural gas, the fracking, and all of that. One has to build this broad kind of political coalition that I was talking about before. If we can connect the dots and make that movement anti-capitalist, it will at the same time be green, anti-racist, pro-union and pro-worker, pro-people as opposed to profits, and green. Look, what the power we are up against is enormous. You take all the Musks and all the extractive energy industries and the automobile manufacturing. You take all of that. This is the banks, Silicon Valley. This is a huge mass of power. You cannot win with them without a huge counterpower. We need a very big coalition, but we need the right kind of coalition. It has to correctly identify what needs to be changed. And my argument is that none of these very urgent but different problems that people are reacting to can be solved unless we disable this dynamic of limitless accumulation of wealth for capital
That takes
and
me.
predation.
How optimistic are you that we'll see a post-capitalist society emerge?
I go through cycles. I mean, a few years ago, I was more optimistic than I am now. I have watched around 2016 the emergence, well, even with Occupy going back to 2011 and the Arab Spring and so on, I have watched movements that I thought had tremendous emancipatory potential, sort of peter out or, not achieve their goals and be hijacked and so on. Even in countries that, like Spain and Greece, that tried to turn the Occupy-type movements into political parties like Syriza and Podemos, they've petered out or been bought off or whatever. So this moment is, we're sitting here after the second electoral victory of Trump with no decent alternative, which infuriates me, really infuriates me. But I don't think we should be completely swayed by the sort of mood of the moment. Things have their ups and downs. We have to believe that there will be, powerful movements for something better. I have to say that in this country, I was very heartened with the depth and commitment of the Palestine solidarity movements that developed, and it has been one of the worst experiences of my life to watch that crackdown, that vicious crushing of that movement. So that's gives me tremendous sorrow and anger, both. But let's go back to one of the many often quoted lines from Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian communist Marxist thinker. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Yeah, this is important.
Pessimism of the intellect, optimism.
Well, because right now there's a lot to be pessimistic about if you think, but we have to somehow find that courage to.
Nancy Fraser, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.